little bit of background on Reverend William J. Barber II. He's been called one of the most unique voices in American public life. Quote, the closest person we have to Martin Luther King Jr., in the words of Cornel West. He's president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach. He's co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. He's a bishop with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He has also served as president of the North Carolina NAACP and is currently on the National NAACP Board of Directors. Finally, he's the author of 4 books, the most recent of which, We Are Called to Be a Movement, was published in June by Workman Publishing. So with that, Dr. Barber, I want to thank you very much for giving us time and giving journalists time to help them understand these issues. I'll turn it over to you, although we have a couple of videos, and so do you want us to start with the videos or start with you?
Thank you so much, Brother Adams. Do I have a, no, I don't have an echo now, do I? I'm just trying to make
no, it sounds fine now.
Great. I do want to start with the videos because one of the things we talk about in the movement is we have to put a face on the facts. And too often we hear these numbers. And so the videos are going to share some particular images. The first one is really strictly some stories on poverty that are counterintuitive. It's not the way we normally talk about it. We often say at times Republicans tend to racialize poverty, Democrats tend to run from poverty and talk about the middle class, and Republicans tend to talk about the wealthy, but no one really puts a face on poverty and all of its many reflections. And then the second one is to kind of continue to show this movement that's building because of the pain and poverty. Then I'll come back after those two. They're not long, but they'll give the reporters a real different kind of insight in what we mean when we talk about addressing the issue of poverty.
Hello, I'm Danny Glover, and I'm a part of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Did you know there are 140 million people in this country who are poor, or one emergency away from being poor, even before COVID-19 hit?
Hi, I'm Gene. I know this is a challenging time for so many of our sisters and brothers. Millions have lost their jobs, have lost their health care.
Meanwhile, just 3 billionaires have the same wealth as half the country.
So we can't be silent anymore about poverty. That's why I'm part of the Poor People's Campaign, this national call for moral revival.
It's time to hear from these 140 million people and see the faces behind the numbers.
My name is Christine Riccio. I lived here in South Carolina since 1997. Poverty and homelessness have been a part of my life story since I was 10 years old. We were short $160 for the rent one month. We asked the landlord for extension for 3 days, and the next thing we know, we got eviction notice. So we moved downtown Charleston to Meeting and Lee Street, where we bought another tent to live in, and prayed that the walls wouldn't shake too bad when the wind blew. We had to beg businesses to use their bathroom. When you never had to be hungry, the people in Washington are sending war machines to other countries to build war against others instead of homes for people here, or medical for people here, or food for people here, for children that are sleeping in their cars, that don't have, that go to bed hungry at night.
Hi, my name is Pamela Roach. I'm from Lowndes County, Alabama, and I live in a mobile home with my 2 kids. They charged me over $114,000 on a mobile home. They're falling apart, and then all animals coming in my house. Possum, I trapped 4 possum in my house, cats and stuff. And I got raw sewage. I don't have no money on power. And I have to travel back and forth to Birmingham to take my daughter with the CPAP machine. Don't have a car and don't have no way to take her. And then we have a high utility bill, and I was paying like $370 a month on the trailer.
My name is Mary Jane Shanklin, RN, and I'm a proud Kansas farmer's wife. My husband, Mark, is a fourth-generation dryland farmer. We live in a 129-year-old farmhouse with barely adequate electricity and barely adequate plumbing. We live in a food desert. There is only one grocery store in our county. We live in a news desert. We have no hospital in our county. And the nearest one is 30 minutes away at 70 miles an hour. And Kansas farmers are at a breaking point because economic stress and polluted groundwater are killing them. Cancer is the second leading cause of death in Kansas. A lot of it is due to the fertilizer and pesticide runoff in the water. We didn't get city water until 1984 on the farm. Before that, it was pond and stream water treated with chlorine. Almost everyone we know has a cancer story. And Kansas farmers' suicide rate is 85 deaths per 100,000, which is higher than our veterans' suicide rate. And it has shot up since 2017 when world grain markets were destabilized by tariffs. Farmers live in an invisible poverty and a silent desperation as foreclosures loom and the blame for being the one who lost the family farm hangs over them every single day.
Pacoima is really important to all of us. Many of us who are here come from this community, including myself. And so it's important when we hear things like 1 out of every 4 students in Telfair is homeless. That means something. It's more than a number. That means that there's children and families who are going without. And that's not right.
The homelessness that you're seeing in the streets of LA, in our community, you can see it in Fresno. You can see it in Sacramento. You can see it in Salinas. You can see it in Chico. You can see it all up and down the state. People encamped in the streets, living in their cars, in RVs, in garages. It's a growing phenomenon. And one thing that's important for me to point out, I don't think this is because people just don't know how to manage their finances. This is an economic devastation based on a systemic root. We're all tied to that root.
My name is Olivia Williams. I work at Starbucks in the Orlando International Airport. My coworkers and I began organizing a union because we were frustrated about the disrespect from the host management. I'm 24 years old and I was hospitalized twice in 2 years from workplace incidents. The pandemic made things worse. We had no training on how to protect ourselves or the public. I speak up and I told them that management only started paying attention to us when we started fighting for the union. I'm not afraid to fight. I've been fighting all my life. I was born with cerebral palsy, and my parents were told I would never walk or talk. Instead, I graduated high school at the top of my class. HMS host underestimates me and my coworkers. But working people like us are strong and powerful when we come together.
This is why we demand an historical investment in resources to end the pandemic of poverty in the midst of plenty.
Repeal of the 2017 tax breaks for the wealthy, relief from poverty and wealth inequality.
I'm tired of watching my friends die in the streets. Everyone has the right to affordable housing and living wages, and that's why I work with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
Thank you so much, Chris, and to my dear friend, President Ephraim, for allowing me to be here today with you all and all of the reporters. I do want that last video, if your videographer would hold it, it's only about 3 minutes, but at the close of this, I want to share that with everybody. And those are links that your reporters can have. Of course, I'm president, as you said, of Repairers of the Breach, which is a group that works on what we call moral analysis, moral articulation, and moral activism. We believe in moral fusion movement, bringing people together around our deepest moral, either biblical or constitutional principles. And we are the co-sponsor of the Poor People's Campaign, along with the Kairos Center, where my co-chair is the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris. The Poor People's Campaign started 3 years ago, and then on June 20th, after 3 years of organizing with people that you saw on the screen from the bottom up, we were organized from the bottom up, from the states up. We now have 46 coordinating committees in all over the country. We have more than 200 partners that have come alongside us, and more than 20 different religious and denominational bodies. And on June 20th, we held the Mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington, a digital gathering. It was going to be on Pennsylvania Avenue, but when COVID hit, and because of the devastating way in which poor people and low-income people are being hit by COVID, our epidemiologists recommended that we not go in the street, but that we hold a digital gathering. In addition, we needed the stage because we weren't putting people up to speak on behalf of the poor. Our gathering, as you just saw, was to introduce people themselves who could tell their stories. But over 3 million people showed up, over 3 million people online and growing. And it was pushed out over 200 and some odd various Facebook platforms. And the people from California to the Carolinas, as you saw Pamela Rush from Alabama, who actually was in the hospital from COVID doing that. She succumbed to COVID, she died a week afterwards. But Pamela Rush from Alabama was one of the poor victims of COVID. But you also saw our dear sister, a farmer, white farmer from Kansas. So we work with folk from Appalachia to Alabama, from California to the Carolinas, from Michigan to Mississippi to Maine. And we are clear, we really believe that there are 5 interlocking injustices, if you want to deal with systemic poverty, that you cannot ignore. And that is systemic racism in all of its forms, from voter suppression to police violence to the resegregation of public schools to continued mistreatment of our Latino brothers and sisters and the indigenous brothers and sisters of the land, systemic poverty, ecological devastation and denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. We believe that they form what we call 5 interlocking injustices. Dr. King talked about 3, poverty, racism, and materialism. We've listed 5 in this current moment that we're in, that we have to address simultaneously, and we have to address with a deep moral fusion model that goes all the way back to the abolition movement that was black and white, all the way back to the Reconstruction movement in the 19th century that was black and white and diverse. And one of the things we teach is that at our best, the greatest transformation in this country have come when we had deep moral intersectional movements that joined together. We also have looked very carefully with our economists and others at like Joseph Stiglitz. Early on, I met with him, Nobel Peace Prize economist, and talked to him about the cost or the price of inequality. We've produced several documents that I would want your reporters to know about. The first one is The Souls of Poor Folk. And you can get any of these by going to www.breachrepairs.org or www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. The Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign and the War on Poverty. Then we produced the Moral Poverty Budget, And then we produced recently the Moral Platform for the Healing of the Nation that was just released. And we did our own congressional hearing and laid out a clear public policy agenda platform with a budget on how to address these issues. We take these matters very, very, very seriously. We have been able to bring together sociologists and economists with impacted people and theologians and historians to address these issues, because we know now what policies and public commitments are needed to address the issue of systemic poverty. We had a Congress called Impact Moral Poverty Action Congress in 2019. Over 1,000 people came together, religious leaders and impacted people and others. At that time, we were the first gathering that brought together 10 people running for president. All of them promised that when they ran, they were going to put poverty at the center. They were going to lift it up. So of course that didn't happen yet. because the consultants, we found out, actually advised presidential candidates not to talk about poverty. We actually had a presidential candidate to tell us that they advised them not to talk openly about poverty. And we have that on film, but we also have all of them on camera saying that these issues must be dealt with, poverty and low wealth. We also presented a budget before the House Budget Committee. And we didn't do it as people on behalf of the poor, but poor and impacted people were there and presented. And one of the Republican senators, while we was there, got upset and said, I never read anywhere in the Bible where Jesus challenged Caesar. So I don't even know why you all are here. And our question back to him was, so you think you're Caesar? If you really think that you're Caesar, then America has some problem a lot bigger than we realized. But what we know, we have the resources, but as the rapporteur from the UN said to us on one occasion, what we have not had is the moral movement, the will, and the kind of public media attention to the issue of poverty and low wealth, which is why I'm so moved. I'm almost in tears to be here today, because one of our goals for the last 3 years was to shift the narrative, was to say you cannot leave these issues on the back burner. And why? Because this isn't about conservative and liberal. This isn't about right versus left. We're not a far left group or far right group. This is really about right versus wrong and about life versus death. It is the language of liberal and conservative is too puny to deal with the issues or the realities of poverty. Because before COVID, if you think about it, before COVID, we had, in terms of poverty, 140 million people living in poverty and low wealth. We use the rate, not just the government rate, but the rate that also looks at the way other income factors into who's poor and who would be poor, because you know the rate that we use to measure poverty is so old that actually it ends up saying if you make $12,000 a year, you're not poor. Well, we know that just doesn't make any sense. And so many economists and others are looking at the supplemental income measurement, which our public policy person, attorney, economist, Shelley Gupta-Bond actually has written a major article on with others. But 140 million people living in poverty and low wealth, poverty and low income. Now, when you think about that, that's 43% of the nation before COVID. 43% of the nations, you heard Danny Glover said, either in poverty or $400 away from having a major economic catastrophe. But that's also was 700 people a day. Columbia University did a study and they said that 700 people a day were dying from poverty and low wealth, poverty and low wealth. That's somebody every 2.5 minutes dying from poverty and low wealth. Now, what does that break down? Because we disaggregate numbers. That's 26 million Black people were living in poverty and low wealth prior to COVID, 26 million. But when you look at that further, that's 60% of Black people, 60% of Black people living in poverty and low wealth. But but in addition to that number 140 million included 66 million white people, 40 million more than Black. But that 66 million is 30% or so of white people. And the numbers continue when you look at indigenous community, Latinos community. That number includes 38 million children in the wealthiest nation in the world. It includes 62 million people who work every day for less than a living wage. Less than a living wage. You heard many of the people that were there talking about they're working and yet they're suffering from poverty in the film we showed. In addition, we knew that before COVID, there were 80 million people plus either uninsured or underinsured. And Harvard did a study that showed how many thousand people die for every 1 million people that are uninsured or underinsured. We knew before COVID that there were 4 million families, for instance, that could get up every morning and buy unleaded gas, but couldn't buy unleaded water. 4 million families, not just in Flint. We also know that the military budget of nearly $800 billion combined, if you cut it in half, would still be more than the total expenditure of Russia, North Korea, China, Iraq, and Iran, even if you cut it in half. And we know that we have this, what we call distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism and so-called white evangelicalism that says that moral issues is not poverty, that poverty is just about people's individual morality. Instead, that distorted narrative teaches that the real moral issue is being against gay people, being for prayer in the school, being against a woman's right to choose, being for guns and being for tax cuts. And we as theologians have unpacked that. You know, I'm bishop with the College of Affirming Bishops that welcomes all people regardless of their race, their color, their creed, and their sexuality directly. And also is engaged in orthodox evangelicalism, the evangelicalism of the Bible. That's what I identify as. One, the Bible, that form of evangelical says that true gospel theology starts with how we treat the poor, whether it's as the prophets like Isaiah, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights, Isaiah 10, or Jesus, where Jesus says, I come to preach good news to the poor. And the word poor there is ptokos in Greek. It means those who've been made poor by economic exploitation. And then on top of all of that, if I go back to racism for a second, we had, before COVID, 26 states since 2010 that have passed racist voter suppression laws. And I want to make a point here. There are a lot of other areas I'll talk to about in a minute about racism, but just on this case, this issue of racist voter suppression, we did a study and found that every state that was a low-wage state, every state that denied even the Affordable Act, every state that was hard and against labor rights was also a voter suppression state. And that the people that got elected by using race, because voter suppression is targeted at Black people and brown people, once they got elected, Brother Adams, they used their power to pass policies that hurt mostly white people. Because in raw numbers, there are more white poor people than there are Black people, not in percentage, but in raw numbers. That isn't often talked about. People don't often think about that when you talk about racism, you're also talking about economics, that voter suppression may be targeted at Black people, but when it's implemented and people are allowed to win offices using voter suppression, once they get in office, they pass policies or block policies that hurt all people, and in raw numbers, more white people. That conversation has not been had. And Dr. King said in 1965, if we did have it, and you could begin to bring together Black and white people, particularly out in the South, around the issue of poverty, who had been divided by the issue of race, because as he said, the aristocracy always sows division when there's the possibility of poor Black folk and poor white folk coming together to change the country and change the power structure. If that conversation is had, it could fundamentally shift the electoral politics in this country. Then COVID hit. And COVID has exposed for us to see what our public health advisors say, the fissures and the wounds. COVID has exposed the fissures and the wounds caused by systemic racism and poverty in our society. To see not only the current administration, the president, but also that these wounds exist and the virus exploits these wounds. And that's why the numbers are so like they are when we look at who's being hurt the most. Yes, it's disproportionate hurting Black people, but it also is disproportionate hurting working poor people and poor people. And so COVID hit. And now we have 184,000 plus people dead, over 6 million people affected. And when you break down that number of 184,000 people dead, a whole lot of them, the majority of them, are poor and low wealth people, people who've had to be essential workers, who did not have sick leave, unemployment, living wages, that have been forced to go into lethal situations. We changed that name from service workers to essential workers, but did not give them the essentials that they needed. Now we have 30+ million people who have applied for unemployment, on top of the already horrendous level of poverty before COVID. 27 million additional people now are without health care because when they lost their job, they lost their health care, because we're the only of the 25 wealthiest nations that connects health care to your job and not to your humanity and to your body. And so that means we're now over 114 million people that are uninsured or underinsured. We know one stat said that jobs that make $40,000 a year, that something like 40% of those jobs will be gone. We know that poverty is going to rise over 43%. We're headed toward 50% of people living in poverty, 50+% of people living in poverty and low wealth. We're facing 40 million people being evicted because we have not, in the first 2-3 bills, the CARES Act, 80% of the money went to banks and corporations. The corporations even got $1.2 trillion that didn't even come through legislation. So we have the money. We've proven in this COVID reality, we have the money, but we choose to still be operating either in voodoo economics, fund the top and it'll come down, or this neoliberalism that says if you help the middle class, it automatically helps everybody else, which is just not true. So we pass a CARES Act, and not one of those acts guarantees sick leave. Not one of them guarantees living wages. Not one of them really expands unemployment like it should have been. Not one of them provides rent forgiveness and rent and moratorium and mortgage forgiveness. And not one of them really ensures people that their utilities will not be cut off for an extended period of time. And so poor and low wealth people in the midst of this are getting hurt. Now we have this so-called help bill that's being held up by McConnell. McConnell says, I'm not going to pass it. Despite all of this pain, all these millions of people that are hurting, I want another $250 billion for $250 billion for $250 billion for tax cuts. I want a F-35 plane, some billions of dollars. I want liability for companies that did not protect their people. And all of this, while the wealthiest statistics tell us, have made $755 billion in the midst of COVID. And so we've had a negligent response of the government that has caused unfounded, unnecessary forms of death, on top of a situation where 43% of the nation never have really come out of depression and denial, who were dealing with poverty. And so here we are. And then in the midst of that, we find out from Columbia University that 69% at that time of the 150 didn't have to die. And then in the midst of all that, we have police violence, these shootings on camera, lynching on camera. And you know the story of George Floyd. He was a low-wage worker. He lost his job, didn't have unemployment, didn't have sick leave, didn't have insurance, went to Minnesota to try to find a job, got a job, but it was an essential job, still didn't have all those things. And went back. By the time he ended up on that street corner, he was already being crushed by the systems and by poverty. And then this officer lynches him with his knee on camera. And the hero is the young girl that stayed there and wouldn't move and kept filming it. And then we get other deaths back to back. And in the midst of COVID, in the midst of people frustrated, in the midst of people at home, people came out. People said, no, we can't take this. And when we heard George Floyd say, I can't breathe, it was as if the democracy took a collective gasp. And so many people who've seen so much death during this period of time said, I can't breathe either. I can't breathe became compelling shorthand of America's enduring system of racism and poverty that endures and causes death in virtually every measure of well-being. I want you to hear that, those reporters. When we talk about poverty, all of the things that we do not fix that could address poverty have a death measurement. Denial of health care has a death measurement. Racism has a death measurement. Denial of wages has a death measurement. Unemployment, denial of education, housing, all of the water quality, air quality, land quality, environmental safety. These things wreak havoc in poor and low wealth white communities and Black communities and indigenous communities and Latino community. And the reason is because we're all inextricably bound together. That's why we cannot have reporting that simply says Black and poverty as though Black and poverty are somehow so simultaneous, so connected that we don't talk about poverty in all of its ways, and then disaggregate the numbers to show that poverty and low wealth is the problem of our democracy. It is a problem at the very foundation of our democracy. Otto Schwammer says, at MIT, one of the problems with our economic systems today is the system of consciousness, the system of not the system of consciousness, but the failure to have a conscience and to understand how we're all connected together. And it doesn't have to be this way. As I close, Dr. King, a half a century ago, said, in our society, poverty, he said, it is murder. Dr. King said this. He said, to deprive a person of a job or an income is a form of political murder. He said that. And now millions of people are being strangled that way. I can't breathe is shorthand for how so many feel. And it's time, we believe, for what we call a moral revolution of values. That's not rooted in left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative, but rooted in our deepest religious values of our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and our deepest religious values. And it's time for every piece of public policy to be examined by its death measurement. And for instance, if denying healthcare has a death measurement, then we believe it violates the founding documents of the Declaration of Independence, which said we are called to have life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And that same document says when there's been a long train of abuses, and there's been a long train of abuses when it comes to poverty and systemic racism and ecological devastation and the war economy, that the people have a right to change that. But we have to face this. Denying living wages and basic income has a death measurement. 700 people die a day from poverty. Denying healthcare has a death measurement. And we have to address what we call necropolitics, the business of who lives and who dies. That's what you're really dealing with when we decide to deal with the issue of poverty and not let it be seen as something on the margins. You cannot say any longer, America, that poverty is a marginal issue when 43% of people are poor and low wealth. And we have to embrace an agenda that's rooted in our fundamental principles, this establishing of justice and promoting the general welfare, and providing for the common defense. Those are fundamental moral considerations that ought to be applied to every piece of public policy. That's what politicians swear to uphold. And you cannot fix the issue of poverty with just generosity from churches. Poverty is an issue created by policy. And so we often get asked, well, what one demand is your top priority? And what we respond to that is we're not asking for one thing. We're demanding that this nation reconstruct everything. We're demanding for the sake of over half of the people in this country that we choose the politics of life and liberation and love. And we're insulted when somebody asks us what one thing do we want when we give the greedy 3 trillion things, 3 trillion things, and they don't even have to hardly fight for it. And so let me tell you what's possible. 5 minutes. If we instituted a $15 minimum wage immediately, it would pay for 49 million workers, would come up out of poverty and low wealth, by $328 billion a year, and that money would go into the economy. If we did a housing wage, we would raise the pay for 83 million workers by more than $1 trillion. If we ended mass incarceration the way we're doing it, we could significantly reduce the $179 billion that currently goes into policing and courts and prisons. If we stop pouring money and resources into our border wall, we could move that $24 billion into children's K-12 education and give life to their dreams. If we canceled one military contract, I want you to hear this, just one military contract, we could have $25 billion to expand Medicaid in the 14 states that haven't already done it under the Affordable Care Act. And as a footnote, all of the states that denied the Affordable Care Act are the same states and the governors that forced everybody to go back quick after COVID. Think about that. On the one hand, they deny health care, and the Affordable Care Act doesn't even take care of everybody. In my state of North Carolina, for instance, the Affordable Care Act would have taken care of 500,000 North Carolinians, 346,000 white, 100-some thousand black, 30-some thousand veteran. The so-called Republican legislature, extremists is what I call them, denied it. Now that North Carolina has 1 million people uninsured. But in other states like Georgia, they denied it too. And if you crunch the numbers, Texas has the highest level of denying health care, and then at the same time, in the midst of COVID, telling people to go back to work. It is so so counter to what a deep moral focus ought to be. If we cancel that one military contract, we could create, if we cancel from others, we could create jobs, infrastructure. If we cut the military budget by $350 billion and close some of our 800 bases around the world, we could take that money and invest it in the country and in really taking care of the veterans, because large amounts of our military budget does not go to the veterans, does not go to the soldiers. There are soldiers in this country on food stamps. It goes to the corporate war economy machinery. If we had put $604 trillion we poured into endless war since 9/11 into green energy, we could have built a renewable energy grid by now at nearly $2 trillion to spare. If we restored the corporate tax rate to what it was before the Trump tax cuts, we would raise $130 billion a year. This would be more than enough resources to fund the $100 billion we need to provide early child care and education for every child in this country. If we instituted a tiny tax on Wall Street trade, we would raise more than $70 billion we need to invest in free public college for all. If we taxed inherited wealth fairly, we would raise $700 billion per year, and this could give life to programs and policies designed to narrow the racial wealth gap, like baby bonds that would establish a saving account with resources for every American. What we have, we know the problem. We have the resources. The issue is having the will, which leads to this. We just did a study called Unleashing the Power, Voting Power of Poor and Low Wealth People with a professor from Columbia. And the reason we're organizing so hard and so deeply because 23 million poor and low income people who were eligible to vote in 2016 didn't. And we went to areas like Appalachia, and we found that a lot of them that voted did not vote. They did not vote for Trump. In fact, the majority of people under $40,000 a year didn't vote for Trump. A lot of them just didn't vote. And when we asked them in places like Harlan County, Kentucky, why? They said, because we, first of all, voter suppression, but we never hear our names, our condition. We organized in Kentucky for the last couple of years, brought people together from the hill, from the hood to the holler, as we like to say. And they turned 3 counties in that state from Republican to Democrat. Now they have a new government. And we never endorsed the candidate. We endorsed a set of issues. We pushed poverty onto the agenda. We noted in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, that decided the presidential election by about 107,000 votes. In those 3 states alone, nearly 2 million poor and low income people didn't vote in 2016. We know right now from our study that in 16 states, poor and low wealth people, if you just organize between 1 and 20%, 1 and 20%, it actually is 1 and 19% in those states, you could fundamentally shift the elections, that the margin of victory could be changed if just 1% in Michigan and 19% in North Carolina of poor and low wealth people were registered and voted, and some of them, if they're already registered, but that were voted. Poor and low wealth people now represent 25% of the electorate. 25% of the electorate, a quarter of the electorate. And in every state, even in the South, they have the power to fundamentally shift the political calculus all across this nation. And I believe that political parties that do not organize and speak to these people and these communities are engaging in political suicide. But more importantly, they're engaging in the undermining of our democracy. How can you not have the issue of poverty and low wealth as a centerpiece in any public policy discussion when it affects 43% of this nation and headed toward over 50% of this nation? And how can we not bring people together? Because every movement, from the abolition movement to the women's suffrage movement, to the early union movement, to the civil rights movement, they were not Black movements alone. All of those movements were intersectional movements. When people came together across race lines and geographical lines and formed unions to help make this country a more perfect union. Thank you for the opportunity. At the end, I want to hold 5 minutes just for that last video for people of my time, but I'll be glad to take questions now.
Okay, so we will go to some questions. Let me ask you a first one, and then we have some questions coming in from our audience. Since we're a journalism organization, we're trying to help give good guidance to journalists and how they do their job. How, in your opinion, how well are the media covering poverty and inequality? What are they doing right, and what are they doing wrong in their coverage of those issues?
Push that to me. I just took a seat. Can you hear me well still?
Yes, we can.
Well, first of all, I think about it. We've had, let's just go back to 2016. I won't go any further. We had 30-some presidential debates in primary and general election. I don't remember one specific question or period of time on how those candidates would address poverty. Even though we're talking about 43% of the nation, 66 million white people. That cannot continue to happen. Media cannot continue to allow candidates to skirt this issue and not do it. And whether it's, we can't let candidates get away with things like, if you just let me cut taxes, it's going to address the issue of poverty. Or people are poor because of their own personal refusal to do any better. Or let's just fix the middle class. Our campaign has actually been critical of both sides of the political aisle. And what we're saying to media is that we can't continue to have political conversations and discourse and not put a face on the issue of poverty and not force it into the political conversation. Now, we had 3 million people come online for the poor people, for the mass poor people's assembly and mass moral march in Washington. We had fairly good coverage, but just be honest with it, not 3 million people, 3 million plus. And I don't know if any one of the stories were not of me, not of William Barber, but of the people you just saw was made front page in the time of COVID. When in fact we know that especially in this time of COVID, poor and low wealth people are the ones being hurt the most because they were already being hurt and they were already dying. So I think we have to, that's why I'm so honored by what you're doing today. Now we're beginning to see more. I will say that we've begun to see more pushing of poverty and these issues into the public square. People are beginning to get more interested in what we're talking about for the Poor People's Campaign. There were some big articles when the Special Rapporteur at the UN did a crisscross across the country about poverty, but it's gotta be deeper. It has to be more prominent and it has to be more consistent because the issue of poverty and the interlocking injustices, and that's the thing, we have to make the connections. The interlocking injustices are hurting and breaking apart the heart of the democracy. And then lastly, we have to make sure we say poverty and low income, because the image too often has been embedded in people's minds. Poverty would mean somebody just homeless on the street, which is bad enough and terrible. Or poverty, it just means minority and black on the margin. And we have to break that. And the media has to be a part of breaking that and has to help us force this into the center place of our American political discussions.
Okay, so let me ask one other question about journalism techniques. You're both adept in talking about studies and facts and figures, as well as sharing anecdotes and people's stories. And journalists do our work through those numbers and through people's stories. What do you think is more effective in getting people to pay attention to an issue they have not paid attention to, previously?
Well, I think right now is to tell the stories and let the stories tell the facts. I think it has to be an integration because again, ever since 1968, we've done everything we can. Remember, the first Poor People's Campaign was assassinated, killed, and murdered. It didn't just stop with Dr. King. And then the war on poverty was undermined by Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, what's his name? He was, they actually, when they came into office with Nixon, dismantled so much stuff. And it kind of drove it off of the political conversation. You think about it, I talked about 2016, but you could go back the last 20 years and ask, when have we ever had, just in the presidential elections, any real conversation around poverty? Now, people are quick to put up the face of middle class people, right? Or put up their face. And we're not anti that, because a lot of people are middle class, but they're just on that corner of falling into poverty and low income. So I think it's the integration of stories, but it must be counterintuitive stories, right? So you take that farmer that you just saw, who are testifying right alongside Pamela Rush. So you got a Black woman from Alabama who's talking about poverty with her tears, and a white woman farmer from Kansas talking about poverty with her tears. That story needs to be lifted up, because it breaks all of these preconceived notions about what poverty and low wealth really is. And then you use that to drive the numbers. But you can't just drive the numbers about poverty, you also have to drive the numbers about the solutions. And that what our studies have showed is the solutions are actually economically prosperous. In other words, it's a lie when we say, number one, we don't have the money, or number two, all we just got to raise taxes and it's going to break this and break that. In fact, if we saw this as a human investment, as an economic investment, we're actually talking about benefiting the whole society as opposed to undermining. And because there's a lie that's been out there, particularly in the South, and that is the lie that many poor white people were told is because other folk are getting these things, you are poor. And we have to undermine that and destroy that, because it was done by design. Lee Atwater said he was going to do it by design as a part of the Southern strategy, and it would be used. It didn't just start with Trump. It's been used for a long. Trump just took it to the nth degree, but it's been out here for a long time, and it's potent and powerful, and it has to be unpacked.
Okay, so let's take some questions. I have a couple of questions that ask about the 5 interlocking factors of inequality. Could you just list off those 5 factors again?
Systemic racism, and let me just give a little brief commentary. When I say systemic racism, we're not talking about name calling and those things, we're talking about the systems. In fact, it's almost wrong to say systemic racism. We have to say that for clarity, but really you could just say racism. It's redundant to say systemic racism. Racism is it's not about name calling and who likes who. But underneath systemic racism, we talk about voter suppression, mass incarceration, desegregation of public schools, police violence and militarism, continual denial of justice to our immigrant brothers and sisters, particularly our Latino brothers and sisters, and then indigenous people, what the continuing mistreatment and injustice toward them. All of that's racism. It's not just Black, it's all of that's part of what we mean systemic racism. Then you have to connect that to systemic poverty and disaggregate all of what the numbers of poverty are part of that 140 million poor and low wealth people. Then we say ecological devastation and denial of health care. That has to do with the water, the air, and the land, and how it impacts communities all across this country. And then we say the war economy, which is a way of saying what Eisenhower said. When Eisenhower said that this nation better be careful of their military industrial complex. And he was a general. He believed in defending the country, but Eisenhower said, in fact, he called it the congressional military industrial complex, and they made him take congressional out, and he just called it, but he said that as a general. So if a general said it, surely we need to be really mindful of how this war economy, Dr. King once said it, whenever a military spending determines, let me paraphrase, determines everything about a society, that society is headed towards spiritual death. And then the last part of it is the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. And I don't have time fully to unpack that, Brother Adams, but this distorted moral religious nationalism and white evangelicalism connects all the way back to when corporate leaders wanted to undermine Social Security. And they paid people to go out and change the theology in the church. That's been documented. There's a book called One Nation Under God by a professor out of Princeton that lays this out both in theology and in monetary terms. I think every journalist ought to get it, because then you would understand a little bit deeper what's going on. It's not just people praying. And then that traces all the way back to slaveholder religion, where the slaveholders had to have a religion that okayed their plantation economic. So systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism are 5 interlocking injustices.
Okay, thanks. What was that book again that you just said we all ought to read?
God, The Purchasing of the American Pulpit is one book. And then there's one by Jonathan Hartgrove called Being Set Free from Slave Master Religion. Because too often, and this is one thing I would say to the media, you know, a lot of times when we talk about religious figures, like if the issue of homosexuality were to come up, or the issue of abortion, we'll put like a Franklin Graham juxtaposed to minister. But we need to be deeper than that. We need to have some clerical people talking about economics and have a Franklin Graham juxtapose somebody like myself or somebody like Reverend Liz O'Hara, because at the end of the day, the push about against a woman's right to choose is the cover up for the larger agenda. And the larger agenda is that most of these folk are connected to heavy money that really is about upholding corporate goals and corporate dreams. And if you unpack it, you can see it. You can see it just as clear as day.
Okay. So as I said before, you can ask a question by audio, raise your hand, and we will call on some of you and turn the microphone over to you. The first one of those questions, audio question from Renee on cue, who is from the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. Renee, the microphone is yours.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, how can journalists use their platforms to not only highlight issues of poverty and inequality, but also make a change? And how do we make sure that we don't lean towards the sign of sensationalism when we're telling other people's stories?
Yeah, that's a very powerful question. And what we do when we go into communities, we get permission to go into community. And what I found is that a lot of folk want to tell their story. They're tired of being ignored. They're tired of what we call attention violence. You know, the people up in the mountains of Kentucky are tired of being, and when I've gone up there, they're tired. They want to tell their stories. Ms. Rush, she invited us in. She said, and if telling my story can help change policy, I wanted to have her, because she basically, for instance, was manipulated into a predatory loan that ended up making her pay $114,000 on a basic sink double wide trailer. Can you imagine that? And all the other things that she faced in that particular community. So I think that there's a large number of people who don't see the telling of their story as sensational. They see the telling of their stories as necessary. And they're tired of being just not paid attention to politically or in the media otherwise. The other thing is journalists, I think, have to, I'm glad you all are having this, connect these issues, sit down with persons who can help connect them, do the empirical data, and also report on these movements. Like, for instance, I wish right now people were talking about the communities all over this country that are on rent strikes. You say, we're not, you know, they're saying, no, you're not going to just throw us out. The communities that are saying you're not going to evict us, homeless communities. You know, the effort, when we talk about, when sometimes Trump says, well, under my administration, income went up. It didn't go up because of him. It went up because of the fight for 15. And the people that have been fighting for years and have won significant victories in certain communities that have caused cities, New York, Seattle, other places, to raise their wages. And so it's important how you can help make change is by telling the story of the movements from the ground up, not just the movement leaders, but the movements that are going on from this ground up. Give me a case in point. We talk about over the last few weeks, is where we say there's been more movement with Black Lives Matter ever in the history of the country. That is true, but you also have to drill down into why. Happened during a pandemic, what happened on camera, but also, as I said in my talk, I Can't Breathe is a shorthand for how so many people are feeling. And then there's so much pain and so much death. And I think what you had is a collision of those things. It's not that George Floyd's death created it all. It was a spark, just like Emmett Till's death was a spark. But what did it spark? It sparked Rosa Parks sitting down to change the system. And then you have to connect that you're seeing diverse activism with BLM, but you also saw diverse activism with Sunrise Movement and with the Women's March and with the Me Too movement and with the Poor People's Campaign. So it's really not an issue of competing. It's more an issue of all of this energy colliding, and helping to tell that story helps us to see it in a different way. One of the things that we've made a mistake on, for instance, on the March on Washington, not the recent one, but the original one, is that when people retell that story, we say it was the I Have a Dream speech. Well, actually it wasn't. The speech was normalcy, never again. That was the speech. And it wasn't just Dr. King. And people didn't come there just to hear Dr. King. He came there because there were 600 cities where activism was going on across the country. And so part of, I think, how you media help change things is by telling that story of all of the activism. Lastly, I wish media companies would say to candidates that are running, we're going to do a presidential forum, but you're going to have to take questions from people who are dying from not having health care. You're going to have to take questions from people who are up in Appalachia suffering from poverty. In other words, make them have to take the whole forum, the whole thing, guided by journalists, but the whole thing be from people who are impacted, so that they can't do the two-step dance around it. They have to actually say what they're going to do if they get elected.
All right, thank you. So next question, audio question from Jill Sheridan at WFYI in Indianapolis. Jill, we're getting you unmuted.
Hey.
The microphone is yours.
Hi. Hi, Doctor. What advice might you have for reporters who are talking about the policies of poverty that relate to the disparity of violence that a lot of metropolitans are seeing right now? When you're talking about, death measures, certainly that's something that is influencing cities right now, and the roots of how poverty plays into that. It's obviously a touchy subject. What advice might you have?
Well, I think you have to do something that Dr. Coretta Scott King did in your reporting, and I'll tell you about that. Before I do that, Jill, let me say hello to a homegirl. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, August 1st, 1963, 2 days after the March on Washington. Coretta Scott King did a piece I think all of you all are reading. She was asked a question about violence. And see, what I'm saying is, if America's ready to talk about violence, let's talk about it. Let's deal with it. Have a grown-up conversation. You want to talk about death? Let's talk about death in all of its forms, not just in one form. And she said in her statement, she said, somebody asked Coretta, how do you feel about violence since your husband was shot and assassinated? She, in essence, said that's a form of violence. But violence is also denying a person health care and education and living wages and labor rights and denying them their culture. She said those are forms of violence. And then she said, and another form of violence is an apathetic attitude that refuses to address these forms of violence. So one of the things we have to be able to do is talk about violence in that way. And that's what you're saying. If you deal with the community where you have large amounts of, let's say, death in communities, you don't walk away from that. Our campaign is against killing, period, whether it's a racist cop that does it, or whether it's somebody in the community that kills one of our babies. We don't make an excuse for that. But just like you have to examine the culture of policing to get at that racist cop, you also must deal with what is the culture in that community. What's been the negligence? What has been the kind of violent public policy denial in those communities? And that's important to lift up, and it needs to be lifted up, right? Why is it that more guns are in that community than jobs? Why is it that there's more crime in that community than there are corporate investments in that community? Or why is the investment in the schools less than the investment in prisons? We have to address all of that. And I think we can. That's the point. I don't think it's either or. It's actually both and. But we need to have some real conversation about policy violence and attention violence. Let me give you an example. I have buried far too many kids from death. I've led, a drug dealer, gangbanger redemption conference at my church, where we actually asked the judge to let us have drug dealers, gangbangers that are on the entry level for 3 or 4 days. We quarantine the church. We bring in people who've been formerly in the gangs and in that world. And we've been able to help bring some folk out, change their lives. But at the same time, I've had to bury people who died from the lack of health care that should not have been. And that's violent. And some of us, pastors, since COVID, have made a commitment that if anybody in our church died, you know, from the lack of health care and unnecessarily, we're going to ask the family, can we have an open casket funeral, just like Emmett Till's mama had an open casket funeral, and invite the media in and say, this is what public policy violence looks like. I think we're at that point in this country, because when you think about the millions, we're not talking about a few thousand people dealing with poverty and low wealth, we're talking about millions of people. And the thing that grabs me every day that I get up is that Columbia study that's actually old, but it's not that old. 700 people dying a day from poverty and low wealth. And then COVID hits and we got another 1,000 on top of that. And so I think to your question, we have to connect the two. The violence that comes from you can't just say, people over here just killing and shooting people because they are somehow just immoral and there's no good. In fact, that's actually not telling the truth about America. Here's something we also have to say about America. America is a violent culture. Dr. King said it. John Lewis said it. That we are a violent culture. Far too many guns, far too many drugs, far too much out here that creates violence. And violence just doesn't happen in the poor community. Violence is all over this country, but that is not a skate around it. I'm not trying to skate around it. I'm saying we need to have a serious conversation about policy violence and all the forms of violence. That's why lastly, we've started saying that every negative public policy has a death measure on it. Every denial has a death measure. And so when we go in and talk to politicians, we don't say, are you on the left or the right? But do you want to deal with death? Do you want to deal with the first principle of our founding doctrine, life, liberty, life? And if we're going to have a conversation about death, then let's have a serious conversation about death. And let's fix the policies that are causing the death.
Okay, so that gives us a nice segue to a question from Lois Collins of the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. Is Congress currently considering measures you believe would be especially helpful to families in poverty?
Not in full. We actually, when we presented our budget, we noted if Congress had taken up our budget last year, we wouldn't have some of the problems we're having right now in the midst of COVID. Because before COVID, people would have had sick leave and unemployment and living wages. We put all of that before Congress last year. And as I said, the first 3 bills we passed, CARES bill, while they did some good, I'm not knocking them. You know, what was finally passed, 83% of the money went to corporations and banks. Democrats did some good things, but there's some things they didn't do, because the first bill that came out of the House said that any company that had over 500 employees didn't have to guarantee sick leave. McConnell has constantly said that he's more interested in putting money toward the wealthy and toward the corporations than he is lifting up community. He's actually said that people are making money off of $600 unemployment, and that's why they're not going back to work, which is just asinine and backwards. So there is a bill now called the HEROES Act, and it has some good things in it. It doesn't have all that we think ought to be in it, because again, it doesn't guarantee living wages. It doesn't guarantee sick leave, unemployment. But it does provide some stimulus. It provides some more unemployment. It provides money for municipalities. And it should have been passed. It's not even all that we want, but it should have been passed when it was pushed over by the House, $3 trillion. Now there's negotiation to cut it, which we already know $3 trillion is not enough. We're doing a study now with the Economic Policy Institute that's going to analyze what's going to happen if we don't face this fully, and if we don't stop piecemealing. We're headed toward not a Great Depression, but a great destruction. When you think about the amount of death, you think about 40% of all the jobs under $40,000 being gone. You think about 30, 40 million people on the brink of eviction. We've not seen anything like that in this country in modern history. So the bill is a good bill. It's not the bill. It should be passed in Congress right now. But McConnell said, I'm not passing it. Why? And this is where he needs to, and let me just say this. When we deal with these issues of poverty, we also have to not just deal with the president, whoever the president is, because it's the Congress, it's the legislature. Give you one quick example. We call President Trump a racist, but McConnell has blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 2,600 plus days. Strom Thurmond refused to pass the Civil Rights Act of 57 for one day. We call him a racist. Well, what is McConnell? And we already know that when you allow voter suppression to happen, we don't have the Protection of Voting Rights Act, that allows people to get elected who then in fact pass policies that hurt the poor. Now going back, I just wanted to put that parenthesis in there, but going back to what you were saying, we're piecemealing this reality. And we're doing something with the Economic Policy Institute that's going to show what's going to happen if we do not have a full addressing of these issues. And we put out in the Poor People's Campaign the things that ought to be passed right now in the midst of COVID. We had 3 public health officials, one from Harvard, one from UCLA, one from Drexel, to come up with what is needed. And the bills fall short, but the bill that's in Congress now at least ought to be passed. But McConnell has said, unless you protect corporations from liability, the very corporation that didn't provide people their PPEs they need and put poor and low-wage workers at risk, and many of them have suffered and died. If you don't give me another F-35 plane, if you do not give me another $250 billion in tax cuts, I'm not passing this bill. So that's why every Monday we've been having something called Moral Monday March on McConnell's Mayhem, Madness, and Meanness. Every Monday. We've had over almost 1 million people to show up over the last 4 Mondays. Mark Ruffalo was on just yesterday with us, calling out McConnell holding up a partial bill. And I want the members of the media to hear this. The bill that's there is not even fully what we need, but it's something. And McConnell will not even pass the something until he gets more for the corporations who have already made $755 billion as of early August during the pandemic. They are making money during the pandemic while people and their lives and their livelihoods are being destroyed and dying during the pandemic.
Okay, so what's that bill again that you would like to see passed again? What's the name of that one?
Heroes Bill.
Heroes Bill.
Heroes
Okay.
Bill. It was passed in the House and now it's sitting in the Senate. It's not everything, but it should be passed at its full rate. They've already now started talking about cutting another $1 trillion off of it. And Nancy Pelosi is saying she won't go below that. But the $3 trillion that they had in it is not enough. And the $3 trillion they had in it still was going to give some more money to corporations, and the corporations already have received trillions. That's really the story of this moment. If the media could tell that story when you talk about Trump, because he's trying to change the channel, wants to talk about false things, the infiltrators and the violence, and not but he wants to get that going. But if we could tell the real story, that what we ought to be afraid of and what's really hurting us is that he and McConnell have made sure that when people are dying and people can't go to work and people are the essential people that are holding up this economy, they only received about 17% of the money. 80% of the money went to corporations and banks, right? And even now they're blocking. That's the story, because that's killing people. It's not just bad policy, it's killing people.
Okay, so a kind of a related question to the congressional policy. People often look to the White House and Congress to appropriate money for programs. There's also a push to have the Federal Reserve step into the inequality debate and making addressing inequality part of its mandate. Do you have thoughts about whether that is necessary or would be effective?
Yes, we think every entity of government has to face this issue of policy and poverty and inequality. Because again, we're not talking about, even if we were just talking about 2% of the nation, we should address it from a moral perspective, the least of these, but we're talking about 50% of the country, right? We're talking about the economic health and future of the nation. You know, if you think about it from a pyramid standpoint, I don't care what's happening at the top. If the foundation of the pyramid cracks and breaks apart, the top's coming down too. It doesn't matter that Wall Street is being upheld right now back through tax buybacks, that where the corporations have taken their tax cuts and purchased their own stocks to keep it high. That's a false measurement, right? That's a false measurement. So the Federal Reserve, the Congress, everybody, all the entities should come together and address in full, a full comprehensive dealing with the issue of poverty and low wealth. Problem is we got to get folks to say it first. As I said, Republicans racialize poverty, Democrats will say poverty, but normally they say people who are working to get into the middle class or the working people. It's like, why can't you say poverty? Why can't you say it? It's real. It's not wrong. So we need to have the words said, but we also need every part of government, because poverty, people who are poor and low wealth are impacted. So yes, the Federal Reserve, we need the banking, the Federal Reserve, we need the environmental parts of government, we need the labor parts of government. All of those entities have to come together and say, we are going to address this in this, the most wealthiest country in the nation.
Okay, so we have time for, I think, just one more question. If somebody else has a question out there and you want to raise your hand, we might be able to get it in. Then we're going to show your final video. And
let me say this.
Sure.
There's no way that the Federal Reserve and the federal and Mnuchin and them can with a straight up, well, maybe they can say we're going to infuse $1.5 trillion into corporations, particularly in the midst of COVID, where people are literally not working and dying, and not say we're going to use those same methodologies to infuse money. And the difference between infusing money in the poor and low wealth community than infusing it in the corporation is normally you fuse it up to the top, they're going to keep most of it to the top. But if you infuse it in the body, it's going to spread out to the whole economy and help lift the economy. That's what we pay people $15 an hour. You pump $368 billion into the economy because it's disposable. People use that income. And so it's a greater investment if you invest in the poor and low wealth communities than it is if you simply pump more money at the top that's already bloated.
Okay, I think this is going to be the final question. It's from a non-journalist, but it's a very good big picture question from Catherine Carroll. Dr. Barber, I'm a disabled woman in Albany, New York, and I'm an attorney, an organizer, and an active member of the New York State Poor People's Campaign since January. Would you please articulate for those people who don't necessarily identify as being poor or overtly marginalized or oppressed why we all are negatively affected by persistent inequality and systemic oppressive forces?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we say in the Poor People's Campaign, we say poor and low wealth, because oftentimes people don't identify as poor. So of course we are actually, what we're finding though is a lot of people don't want to be identified as poor, and that means something wrong with them. But they don't have any problem with being identified as poor because the systems keep them poor. You know, somebody that's poor that's working, it's not they're not working. They're working in low-wage jobs. They're working in jobs without health care, without the things that they need. But again, what we know from this, as Joseph Stiglitz says in his book, The Price of Inequality, that in a society, when you have a consistent above 40, nearly 50% of the people living in poverty and low wealth, that will always keep your economic systems unstable. It's going to cost. We are actually hurting our economy. We're hurting ourselves. We're not being our best in terms of the development of this country, and it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary. And when you see it, Chris, is when COVID hit. See, people were kind of ignoring it, but now COVID has exposed the fissures of poverty. You think about where we would be right now if we, going into COVID, everybody had health care. Everybody had a living wages and had some money they could stay out of work for a minute. Everybody had sick leave and unemployment. All the things we're talking about passing now, even with the CARES Act and the health bill, those things should already be a part of our reality. So the reality, and so the poverty and low wealth are the matters of national security. And we refuse to address poverty and low wealth and these other four interlocking injustices at our nation's peril. We cannot survive like this. We cannot survive with an impoverished democracy where your voting rights are threatened, where people are working every day and can't live or living in their cars, where if a child is born poor, it's more likely they're going to remain poor. Whereas Dr. King says we keep getting this check back marked insufficient funds, and yet we see all the funds riding around town, if you will, the metaphor, and we see the money, we know it's in the bloated military budgets, we see it at the top. You cannot continue to have domestic tranquility. You cannot continue to say you believe in the establishment of justice and the providing for the common defense and promoting the general welfare. We cannot claim to be a deeply moral and exceptional nation when nearly 50% of the people are poor and low wealth. Our economic systems will always be shaky and up and down. And so we refuse to address this issue at our own peril as a society. We are not experiencing genuine democracy. If the poverty we have today is just as ugly as plantation capitalism that allowed slavery to exist for 250 years, and it didn't have to. We must break this. We must address these issues. And thanks to the sister who's a part of the Poor People's Campaign and who also identified as disabled, I do understand that. And here's the last thing, and I'll let you do. The answer is not in the politician. We are being called to be a movement. If poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality, and every ability, we actually now, the rejected of this society, have the power to build a political force that can change the focus of our public policy. And we are, and we will, and we must. We are not going anywhere. That's what the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And I will say on this call lastly, we didn't march on June the 20th in mass, that 3 million people came online. We're now gonna march to the polls because we got these numbers and we know that we just 2 or 3% of poor, low wealth people in places can change the electorate, can change the Senate. The Senate, the makeup of the Senate is in the hands of poor and low wealth people right now. But next year, COVID gone, we intend in every race, creed, and color to bring our movement to the streets for the soul and the sake of America. We won't be silent anymore. We can't be silent. And we're bringing together a counterintuitive movement, which is what I want you to see now with this video. I want the journalists to see what a counterintuitive movement looks like and why we have to do this.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
At one time, poverty was a temporary condition. You were on a down slope for a minute, but you could bounce back up. We can't bounce back up today. It's permanent. We're not going back to the factory and building cars and trucks like we once did.
A job working at McDonald's or the grocery store doesn't pay enough for one person to live.
We work a 40-hour work week, still not enough. Living from paycheck to paycheck. Rent is $600 a month. We got water bill, electricity. I do this for my kids, and it hurts.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am a working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
We were in the height of mass water shutoffs. This entire neighborhood was shut off all at one time.
I saw all my neighbors get shut off right in front of me. It was kind of terrifying.
I'm 42 years old, and I'm a cashier at McDonald's. I had lost my house. You're welcome to come inside. There's a lot of people that are living in their cars. You never notice until you're in the same situation.
I don't have stuff to give my children. I'm paying all these bills, and they need school clothes and stuff. They be asking me for, I can't get it to them.
Now I'm a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide. Why? They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs.
I see poverty in my own community. You know, there's a 70% unemployment rate in the reservation right now.
Here in New York City, we're home to millionaires and billionaires, and we have so many people living in the street, and that's just not right.
I've been a homeless veteran twice, lived in a shelter.
I've been living down here since I was 17.
My only chance of going to college was joining the Army. We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
700,000 people in this country are on the verge of losing their food stamps.
This budget calls for shrinking the social safety net programs like Medicare.
I just know that everything that's happening to us isn't right.
I'm in stage 5 of kidney disease. I fell behind on my health care and they canceled my health insurance and they told me I have to wait until open enrollment. There's only 5 stages of kidney disease and I'm in the 5th stage. Murder, it's murder. You know, if you ask me, it's murder.
I lost a son to gun violence and I lost a daughter.
No parent should have, in America, should have to bury their child for a lack of medicated space.
I'm wailing because my children
My God.
are no more.
My God. My God, Kevin.
I'm wailing, y'all. I'm wailing. Because my babies ain't no more. How many more babies? How many more children? No more.
Rich, that's the serious reality. Now, I could have a video that would show you the people rising up, but I wanted deliberately to put that and leave it there, just that sober, because the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. And some of us have said in this moment, when any of us could be dead in 48 hours, be on a ventilator because of COVID, some of us have made a pact to say, ask this question, what would we be doing if we knew we only had 48 hours of breath left? And so some of us have said, we're gonna make a pact that we're gonna live like we only have 48 hours left. And some of the people you saw there, and saying we're gonna fight every day. We're only gonna give our breath to things that address these 5 issues, whether we live 48 hours or 48 days or 48 minutes or 48 years. And I wanna really, as a clergy person, as a bishop in the church, as a pastor, plead with the media to make this a centerpiece issue, because those are the people, not about me. I grew up poor, I could tell you that, but it's the people all over this country. And they have the power to shift this nation. But so many times as I've traveled around this country, they feel like nobody will even call their name or call their situation. They see election and campaign season go in and go and come and go. And no one ever, even for just one debate, focuses extensively and exclusively on the issues facing, which will soon be more than 50% of the country. I am so thankful that you all are allowed to do this, folks. It's a prayer. I'm about to cry because it's a prayer we've had in the movement. It's a prayer we've had in the movement that journalists would take seriously this issue, because I've been in too many places where if people would just received as human beings and we would talk about them and we got everything we need to change this. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be this way. And the people are saying, those are the people that are saying it's not going to be this way. So my time is up. Thank you so much. And let's tell the truth and set this nation free.